Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay or Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
This conversation is for every elected politician in Washington as they listen on 99.1 FM this morning. Douglas Irwin is an institution. Blanche Flower is not an institution. He's just a macroeconomist.
Right.
Doug Irwin is an institution at Dartmouth College. In his youth, the definitive book, and still fresh, is Against the Tide. It was definitive at the time. More recently, is Clashing Over Commerce. For those of you on YouTube, it's over his right shoulder right now in his book-lined office. Professor Irwin, we are honored that you would attend today. If you were to meet with a congressional leadership today, how should they respond to what the executive branch has wrought?
I would say that under the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, you have power over tariffs. And the problem has been is successive Congresses have delegated so many powers over tariff setting to the president on the assumption that the president will basically act in the national interest and tend to lower tariffs and reach trade agreements, that Congress has given up its authority. So it's time for Congress to stand up and assert itself a bit more on trade. Their constituents will be hurt by many of these measures, and yet the Republicans seem to be very quiet about it.
How will they affect that reassertion? Do they need the judicial branch to support them, or do they just sit down with a beverage of their choice? What do they drink at Dartmouth? It's like Labatt's?
Yes,
they
exactly.
have like Labatt's. Yeah. Doug Irwin, do they have a Labatt's with the president and say, this is too much?
I think you have to look back to the first Trump term when President Trump almost pulled out of NAFTA. And he was convinced by his Secretary of Agriculture and a few congressional allies that that would not be a right move, that he should renegotiate it because they were pointing to the harm that would be done to his voters, farmers in the Midwest, manufacturing firms in the upper Midwest that depend on exports. And so that sort of helped convince him in terms of a longer run solution of changing legislation to empower Congress more. That's sort of a long run solution to what is now a short term crisis.
Doug, how do we think about tariffs in a global, intertwined economy? It's not like the 1800s where we imported a relatively small number of goods. We exported a relatively small number of goods. In the global economy, the tariffs, how do they work?
Yeah, you're right. It's actually very different than it was a century ago. A lot of trade a century ago was sort of in final goods or in very basic raw materials. And now what we have is integrated supply chains and international production networks. So the web of commerce and the degree to which firms in all sectors are sort of bound to the global economy in some way is so much more extensive today than it was even 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago, that tariffs have much more ripple effects throughout the economy. And these proposed tariffs will rip apart North American supply chains and be quite extensive in terms of the reach that they will have.
Doug Irwin, you mentioned Frank Taussig, the giant at Harvard years ago. This is, folks, 100 years ago, writing on tariffs. To me, there's a whole mythology going on right now, whether it's a president's affair with Mr. McKinley from another time and place. We trot back, Lisa mentioned Smoot-Hawley this morning, or we go back to August of 1971 when the world turned upside down with Richard Nixon and gold. Which myth, Doug Irwin, is most wrong?
Well, I'd say the myth that the U.S. economy grew in the late 19th century when we became an industrial power because of the tariff. There's a classic case of correlation not being causation. So there are a lot of reasons why the U.S. became an industrial power after the Civil War up until World War I. We had massive immigration. Not many people in the Trump administration mentioned that. We were the recipient of major capital inflows from Britain and other countries. We were adopting technology from then the technological leader, Britain. We were pretty much open to the world, except in trade. So we did have high tariffs, but they did promote manufacturing a bit. But if you look where the productivity growth was, it was in the service sector. It was railroads, and then later electrification and telecommunications. It wasn't just manufacturing and becoming rich because of the tariff walls.
If you're just joining us this morning, I'm Bloomberg Surveillance, and thank you for joining Bloomberg. We continue with Douglas Irwin of Dartmouth College. Many good guests coming up, including Damian Sassower in foreign exchange, the Dow negative 591. To Irwin of Dartmouth, Paul Sweeney.
Professor, talk to us about these tariffs in the context of they seem to be enacted by President Trump in response to non-economic issues per se, maybe whether it's the fentanyl coming into this country, whether it's immigration policy from our neighbors. Is that kind of the way tariffs should be used, typically are used? How do you think about that?
Well, what's interesting about these is they haven't really been vetted by the Trump economic team. His U.S. trade representative is not in office yet. We've just had the confirmation of the Treasury Secretary, Commerce Secretary to come. So usually when countries impose tariffs, and usually when the U.S. has done this in the past, there's an interagency process where you deliberate and you figure out what is the best case and how can we make these work. And I think these are a little bit in advance of those advanced discussions within the administration. So I think you get this hodgepodge of reasons why we're doing this. It could be the fentanyl flows or the migrants, but we also hear still about the trade deficit. I mean, when President Trump makes these statements, it comes back to the imbalanced trade. And he's actually ordered a review on that. But it's very hard for other countries to negotiate, and there are 10 different things that are being flung at you at what in terms of what you're doing wrong.
Doug Irwin, honored to have you here for breaking news. This is from Doug Ford. He is a premier of Ontario. He's basically, Ontario stretches from just north of Hanover, New Hampshire, all the way over to Carleton College in Minnesota. But the Ontario government says they will cancel all U.S. contracts. And what's important is this is, quote, "We're going one step further. We'll be ripping up the province's contract with Starlink." And of course, that has to do with Elon Musk and all that. Doug Ford, service sector hasn't been talked about much. Do you expect service sector to be harmed as much as the goods sector?
Not as much because they're not directly hit by tariffs, but there's a complementarity between trade and services and trade and goods, and the two often go hand in hand. So if you disrupt trade and goods, there's going to be some spillover effects, negative ones, for the service sector as well.
Professor, some of the concerns here as it relates to tariffs, just in general, is that they are inflationary in the U.S. economy. How do you think about that?
Well, I don't think they don't cause inflation in the sense of a sustained increase in the CPI. They are sort of level effects. So they will increase the level of consumer prices and industrial prices. So that will lead to a bump in measured inflation. It's not clear that the Fed has to respond to that. But what that means is the declining real income and purchasing power of those businesses and households. Right. I mean, just to give you a personal example, which I shared on social media, yesterday I got an email from Irving Oil, which provides us with propane, saying that any tax that's levied on them as they ship propane from Canada to the U.S. will be directly added to the bill that we're facing here in New Hampshire. So even before the tariffs took effect, we're already being warned prices are going to go up.
Lighthizer, and it's on my table at home. No trade is free. Robert Lighthizer focused on China. Lighthizer pushed aside in the second Trump administration. Doug Irwin, on a 10% tariff on China, how would you suggest Beijing will respond?
Actually, I'm a little bit less worried about China, and I'm a little bit surprised we're going after our allies and ripping up North American supply chains by going after Canada and Mexico. I mean, the big rival to the U.S. and big problem in terms of trade has been China. And yet President Trump has de-emphasized that. So I'm not going to agree with Robert Lighthizer on many things, but to the extent that he's focused mainly on China, I think that's where the administration has to look too.
So, Professor, how do you think the governments of Canada and Mexico should respond, will respond? How deep is this going to go, do you think? How long will this go, do you think?
Well, it's very interesting. There's a report that the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, will be speaking with the President today. So I'd say there's a small chance things could get averted, even though I wouldn't be too optimistic about that. But I think they're responding in the way that actually they did, at least Canada did, with the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930. That is, not to take it sitting down, to retaliate. And they're very strategic in terms of the goods that they put pressure points on that are important in the U.S. when putting those tariffs on. So they try to impose tariffs on things that will maximize the political harm in the U.S., but the least economic harm for Canada because there'll be substitute products that they can import.
Doug, the world stopped for against the tide, an intellectual history of free trade 30-some years ago. The final chapter 30-some years ago, page 217, the past and future of free trade. Okay, WTO. I was in Jimmy Chang's office in Hong Kong the day WTO collapsed. Doug Irwin, what is the future of free trade after GATT, after Uruguay, after WTO, and now Trump? What is the future?
Well, it's going to be a bit of a mess, and it could be basically redrawn lines of trade based on geopolitics. But, most countries, speaking outside of the U.S. now, most countries have a tremendous stake in the trading system and open trade. They're much smaller economies. They've opened up over the past 30, 40, 50 years or so. They received economic benefits by and large from that. And to undo that is harmful for them. So I think even if the U.S., because of our politics or what have you, move in a different direction, the rest of the world will still be open for business to the extent they can.
I mean, Doug, I know hitters like Jamie Dimon are listening, Brian Moynihan and others in banking, maybe Christine Lagarde. Good morning, Madam Lagarde, and your team in Frankfurt. Doug Irwin, on the x-axis, forget about J-curve dynamics, I don't buy it. On the x-axis, Professor Irwin, we shift from an inflationary dynamic of tariffs over to the growth or less growth dynamic. On your time continuum, what's the when of that? When do we shift from a study of inflation higher to growth slower?
Well, there have been a lot of independent forecasts of these Trump tariffs from the Tax Foundation, from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and from other entities. And none of them have any positive effects. It's always negative. And the question is, given the scenario, how negative you go? You shave 0.2, 0.3, 0.4% off of GDP. Those are sort of where the numbers are coming in. And those will come in fairly quickly. If we actually see the tariffs go into effect on Tuesday, we'll probably see, certainly by the second or third quarter, somewhat slower growth. Now, once again, that doesn't mean it's pushing us into recession, but it just means that after a year or two, our real GDP will be lower than it otherwise would have been.
I got one final question, Doug. You're sort of up in, the edge of Canada.
Yeah.
Hanover's really I mean, it's on a Connecticut river, and it's sort of like New York North.
I mean, those are hardy people up there.
They're hardy, yeah. It's a Dartmouth bubble.
Yes.
What are you telling somebody over a cup of coffee this morning, Doug Irwin, in Victoriaville, Quebec? You're at a diner in Victoriaville. What are you telling them to do? What should Canada do?
Canada was very savvy during the first Trump term. They made we talked about Congress. We opened our discussion with Congress. They realized that maybe the administration was not going to be very sympathetic, but members of Congress are, because they are much closer to how their constituents will be affected by this. And so they worked state legislatures, they worked on Capitol Hill, and tried to create an environment where it constrains the administration in terms of how much they can push things and what they can do. So there may not be much support for Canada in the White House, but there are other pressure points in the business community and in state and legislatures and elsewhere that they can try to contain the damage that will be done to them from these tariffs.
Douglas Irwin, honored that you could attend. Go back to class, get the chalk in your hand, and teach the
Okay,
children.
I won't tell Blanchflower what you said.
Okay, don't tell him. He's probably down in Florida right now, distant from the tariffs. Doug Irwin, thank you so much. And to David Blanchflower, thank you so much for his support of all of Dartmouth Economics.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Joining us now, Lori Calvasina here, with the small stocks down 2%, is as well. I mean, Lori, to cut to the chase, can strollers move the needle on export-import dynamics?
I don't know about strollers, Tom. I don't think I ever paid $1,000 for either one of mine.
Smart.
I'm not gonna lie.
There's one here, I kid you not, folks. The Junama Pilot Collection Baby Pram is $2,300.
Nice. That's what we're talking about. In style.
And there's a small cap out there making that puppy right now. Is this an opportunity, Lori Calvasina? I mean, you're with the Royal Bank of Canada. Is this an opportunity to acquire stocks?
Look, it's always a good day to buy stocks, right? Look, I think the reality is that we're seeing a little bit of a sell-off today. It could have been worse. I do think that we've had some valuation problems in the market. I do think we've had some froth in the market. If you look at the CFTC data on U.S. equity future positioning, I do still think it's going to be a good year in the equity market if we kind of get through this issue. And I've told people, common talking point today has been, look, if you think about my S&P 500 forecast, 6,600 at the end of the year, not because of tariffs specifically, but I have baked into that number the idea of a 5 to 10% drawdown. We do have a bear case ready to go of 57.75 should certain conditions be met. Those conditions have not been met, but there are things we have to keep an eye on. 10-year yields, how do they react to the environment we're in right now? What about these vibes? We've been hearing about these vibes that were supposed to be so fantastic and explode post-election, and yet we've had two disappointing prints on the consumer sentiment and confidence surveys. And now we've got businesses talking a lot about uncertainty from the tariffs denting some of the post-election optimism. So there are things we've got to watch. We've got to be vigilant. I think we're still on a good path. Are the odds that we could get knocked off that path up? Yeah, they're up a little bit.
Lori, how important are earnings to the 2025 performance in this market? Because it just doesn't feel like I'm going to get that much from the Federal Reserve in terms of rate cuts. So it feels like I need to rely upon earnings maybe a little bit more.
I think that's fair, Paul. And, we sort of have said this for two reasons. Number one, if we do our modeling on the valuation side and plug in current assumptions, whether it's my guys at RBC or the consensus numbers on things like inflation, the Fed, 10-year yields, I can't come up with that rosy of a number for the market at the end of the year. Valuations have moved a lot, and they've done it on the backs of inflation ramping down. And now it looks like inflation, there may be some upside pressures there. So I think it's tough from that perspective. And if you just take a more kind of simplistic analysis and look at a forward PE on the S&P 500, and you can all these different versions, all my charts are showing me that we've kind of hit a ceiling and we're moving down a little bit. So I think valuation expansion is tough to come by. Earnings matter. Margin expectations have been coming down. I do think that there are potential negative impacts to earnings, both from demand, margins, a variety. The dollar is something else to watch from this tariff situation, and things like the dollar are already starting to pinch.
Is there a small cap Mag 7?
Oh, I think there are names that small cap investors end up crowding into. They don't like the fact that they do it, which is one of the things I love about the small cap investment community. But, I do think we've had a little bit of a squeeze on quality. And what I mean by that is you've seen just the quality characteristics of the Russell 2000 degrade, nearly half of its negative earners, a lot of things that are kind of low liquidity, tiny market cap that, frankly, active managers just can't buy. And so they do tend to gravitate to kind of the bigger small caps, more liquidity, higher quality stats. But it's more expansive than a Mag 7.
It's been wonderful. Too short a visit. Lori Calvasina, thank you so much. With RBC Capital Markets, she'll be publishing in the coming hours.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
This is important as we talked to Douglas Irwin of Dartmouth College here, and he really mentioned, where's the legislative branch? We continue with that on a gentleman from Harvard and now at Yale, Gautam Mukunda, joins us here. And I want to go back to your book, Indispensable, When Leaders Really Matter. Where is the indispensable leadership of Republicans and Democrats in Congress and the Senate, given this upset we have?
Democrats have no idea what they should do, and Republicans have been broken to Trump's will at this point. We've seen just about everybody come in.
Is there a historical precedent to the way, quote, Republicans have been broken, unquote?
In the United States? It's hard to think of one. Even Franklin Roosevelt faced more domestic
In 32.
challenges,
Yeah.
from his own party than Trump does right now. Just to put this in context, Donald Trump has higher approval ratings from Republicans, just from Republicans. He's essentially nothing from anyone else, than Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush ever did. I think he might actually have higher numbers than Eisenhower did. Right, he is the most popular Republican president among Republicans in the history of polling.
So what do you think he does with that type of popularity here? I mean, it feels like tariffs are kind of, I don't know, they don't seem like that big a deal to me. I mean, one could argue if you had that type of support, one could do some really big things. How do you think that he and his administration think about their popularity and support?
So the question here, right, is how much do they care? Right, so Donald Trump is particularly sensitive to popularity issues. He always has been, and this might just be an exercise in getting people to bend the knee and sort of defer to Donald Trump. And okay, then there'll be some damage from that, but not catastrophic. But the biggest moves that Trump has made are personnel as policy, putting loyalists in charge of the major organs of the major internal and external security organs of the government. And that gives him the ability to put pressure on the opposition in ways that we've never seen in the United States before.
Have you talked to the Secretary of Treasury who darkened the door in New Haven years ago?
I have not talked to wait, Secretary Bessent?
Yeah.
No, I haven't spoken to him yet.
Okay, I mean, I find this absolutely fascinating, and that you're sitting in the pit there doing the Yale management dance with a piece of chalk in your hand. What is your mandate to executives to communicate to their comfortable Republican candidate what this will mean for Carlos Gutierrez, Kellogg's, or Tyson Food, which Lisa just mentioned, with their huge dark meat to China strategy? What do executives say?
So I think the first one is that if they don't realize it now, they will soon. The United States government has been uniquely stable for a couple of centuries, just basically longer than any other country in the world. And American business has been the extraordinary beneficiary of that. If that goes away, it will have consequences in ways that we cannot predict, but that are gargantuan. I'll just say as a general rule, it's when the things that you so deeply believe about the world that you don't even think about them turn out not to be true, that you have the biggest impact. And here is one where the basic underlying principle of everything in global economics and everything in global foreign policy has been the U.S. government kind of knows what it's doing. That assumption is breaking while we speak, and that will change things for it. I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. PEPFAR. So PEPFAR is the program. It's created by George W. Bush, distribute antiretrovirals in Africa. There are statues to George W. Bush in Africa. There are children named after him because of the scale of this achievement. When they put out the spending freeze, people just stopped getting their drugs in Africa the next day. If PEPFAR goes away, the estimate for South Africa alone, just South Africa, is that in the next 10 years, 600,000 people will die. That is the sort of achievement, right? Only the United States can do things like that. It is a gargantuan achievement. It costs the average American like $1 a year or something like that. It's just an insignificant expense. And it buys us not just helping to keep people alive, it buys us sort of acceptance, allies, China.
President Trump has huge popularity numbers. I think there's going to be a lot of polls that agree with his speed, his thrust. But part of that is to say to CDC in Atlanta, they can't talk to the World Health Organization. Basically, the global medical system shuts down. What do you suggest the legislature, our Congress, could do about it, if anything?
So Democrats have the ability to essentially bring the Senate to a halt by manipulating rules. Right. So deny unanimous consent on everything, force everybody to be in there. They can do a lot to beat obstacles.
Do you see that yet?
No, not at all.
Did you see Rahm Emanuel? He was on Morning Joe this morning. We're efforting Mr. Emanuel here on a blistering essay in the Post this weekend on his Democratic Party.
It's quite astonishing. So not just in the legislature, Gretchen Whitmer has said she wants to cooperate and is out sort of selling the kids' version of her autobiography. Gretchen Whitmer has phenomenal political instincts, so I'm not going to say, well, that's crazy, but it's a surprising tack for her to take. I also wonder if to some extent Democrats are not just looking at the fire hose of things coming out of the Trump administration and saying, any one of these individually is likely to be pretty unpopular, and the combination, not with Republicans, but with most Americans, and the combination of them is likely to be extraordinarily unpopular. So, as we've talked about before, American public opinion is thermostatic. Whatever the president does, people move against it. If you do things that are unpopular, they move against it even more strongly. If you interfere, this is the really striking one, with the Treasury's payment system, which literally touches the life of every single American every day, every moment, people are going to feel that right away, and it is going to have pretty significant consequences. The trade stuff, I agree with you, Paul, that I think at a macro level, the economics on that they're not going to be huge. But the individual people who are hurt by this are going to be hurt a lot, and they are going to scream really, really loudly. And that has political consequences that may be larger than the economic ones.
Are you surprised that maybe we haven't, thank you, Ken, are you surprised that maybe we haven't had someone from the Democratic Party really established himself or herself as a contra voice to President Trump and his policies? I mean, the only person I kind of hear from is Schumer. But I mean, does the Democratic Party need a new voice, a new vision?
It definitely does. The basic problem for the Democrats is not that they lost the 2024 election. That was baked into the inflation numbers. I don't see a scenario where they win that election. The basic problem for Democrats is they are not competitive in 25 states. Right, so it's almost impossible for them to take the Senate. They started a huge handicap, and that is about larger institutional, structural shifts in the party that are pretty severe. You can talk about any, like there are a million different explanations. My favorite one would be an activist class that essentially is educated at Ivy League schools like mine and talks only to themselves and does not have a sense of that. You can see Democrats who are likely to break out of that mold. I mentioned Gretchen Whitmer is a popular one. Two names that people don't talk enough about: Ruben Gallego and Seth Moulton. And I mentioned both of them because they both went to Harvard, but they're both Marines. They are not part of the activist community where we only talk to, right? They know how to talk to people who are out of that mold, and they're very good at it.
We're out of time. This has been really informative on an emotional day. The tariffs clicking in here at midnight tonight. Mr. Ford of Toronto and Ontario out with blistering statements today, including walking away from Starlink. And Mr. Musk as well. Gautam Mukunda is with Yale University, and I'm sure we'll hear more from him.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.
On the front page is a Lisa Mateo hour. Lisa, what do you got?
Okay, we've been talking about tariffs, so I have to start there. Canadian sports fans are actually letting the U.S. know how they feel about it. They're booing the national anthem sporting events. We're talking from the NBA to the NHL. So this happened yesterday. The Raptors were facing the Clippers in Toronto, and a 15-year-old performer, she got out there and she was greeted with applause until she began singing the Star-Spangled Banner. Yeah, they weren't too happy about it. Started booing. This is from actually an ABC affiliate. They pulled this down from a social media post, but it's just this growing trend. Like, it wasn't just that game. It was Saturday during the anthem before NHL. You had the games in Calgary, Ottawa too. Last night, Canucks fans in Vancouver, they booed the anthem before their team took on Detroit. So it's this ongoing battle kind of showing the frustration. Yeah. Some fans, though, did say they felt bad, but the majority of them are really
I defer to you two because I grew up in Toronto South, a place called Rochester, where, I think I was the first one in America to drink Molson Gold.
Sure.
But often. But I don't have a clear thinking on this. I'm just too close to Canada and all that.
I do, but so next.
Moving on. So Michael Barr, you heard him giving the Grammy wrap-ups, right? So I just wanted to do a little bit more on the two voices that were kind of unrecognized. I had a couple of snubs along the way. So yes, Beyonce did win Album of the Year, Cowboy Carter, right? 5th time she was nominated for it. She also won Best Country Album. Her total trophy count now stands at 35, but it was this whole thing, like she kept getting snubbed and kept getting snubbed, and finally she wins it. for her country album. And then on the flip, you also have Kendrick Lamar. He got Song Record of the Year for Not Like Us, which actually originated as a Drake diss song. But he was snubbed from that prize 4 times. So all these people who were getting snubbed. He actually, what was interesting is that he beat out Record of the Year over Now and Then, which was this kind of resuscitated Beatles demo supposedly made with AI. But they're just saying it's a victory for rap music because it's only won Album of the Year twice. I mean, I think it was Lauryn Hill and then Outkast. So that was a lot of the talk here. So
you know what the buzz is this weekend? The Weeknd has a new album out.
Oh,
I heard a
look
little
at
bit of
you.
it. Awesome.
Ah.
Awesome. You know, awesome. Mike Dean is the one putting it together. It's just hugely anticipated.
There you go.
Next.
Oh, and he's also
one
at
more.
the Super Bowl too, performing. Okay, so Chick-fil-A, they want to make their drive-thrus faster. So this was an interesting look from this journal into how they're using high tech. Like this was a restaurant operator, Rockford, Illinois. They had this new drive-through record. It served 1 car every 13 seconds.
Wow.
But they still want to improve it. So they're looking at different things. Security footage right in the kitchen, but also drones. They're using drones to kind of hover over the parking lot and take footage so they can look at it. And they actually found a few things where they can work on, like veteran workers taking on too many duties, the Wi-Fi used by the parking lot order takers, because you know they have them out in the parking lot. It didn't extend far enough. So they were kind of getting kicked off the Wi-Fi as they were trying to take in all these orders. And so the company's just using like a lot of these experts. They're dispatching them to like 3,000 of their different restaurants. But the interesting thing is how it's forcing a lot of other food chains who don't normally use drive-thrus to use them. Like Chipotle is starting to use drive-thrus.
Really?
Yes,
I didn't know that.
because of the online orders are so huge. And Shake Shack is starting to use drive-thrus now.
Isn't it just complexity of the menu? Like when Paul goes in and gets his triple forple latte.
Starbucks, they're reducing the complexity.
They're
of that.
reducing the complexity.
Because apparently the amount of combinations you can use on a Starbucks menu is mind-boggling. So I'm going to try to
Lisa
simplify
Mateo,
that.
thank you so much for the news this morning, the newspapers.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday, 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.